Well, firstly, thanks very much to CDKN for inviting me to speak, and to ODI for hosting this. Yes, I am fresh off a flight from Washington, which was delayed 3 hours. As the pilot pointed out, we probably preferred to be on that aircraft rather than the one they didn't bring over from the UK, where the landing gear wasn't working properly. So we thought, on balance, a 3-hour delay was worth doing. And I do recommend the Heathrow Express. It does cost, I gather, more per mile than Concorde used to. But it does have large, generous-sized toilets in which you can change and wash. You can't have a shower, but you can look decent if you have to come straight off the flight and hair your way to one of these events. WWF's mission, so I can see that one there, right, is to stop the degradation of the natural environment. Well, at least that's part of the mission. We have actually quite a long mission statement, and I can't remember all of it, but there's some key bits of it that I certainly do remember. And of course, for more than 50 years, our famous panda logo has been probably one of the most renowned and respected symbols of conservation and environmental protection. And to this day, we're recognised as one of the world's leading conservation organisations. But WWF goes further than that, in fact has done since its founding. The picture you're seeing here is sort of WWF's daily bread. This is a picture of the Mau forest complex in Kenya's Rift Valley province. Well, I say it's a picture of a forest. Fairly obviously, it's actually a picture of what's left of a forest. Now, the forests there are an important catchment for the main rivers that provide water to the western part of the country, but they're under threat from things like the expansion of agriculture, which I remember seeing some time ago when I was there. We've been working there to promote restoring the forest, effective management of the remaining forest, and we've been doing that for a decade. But nevertheless, the environmental degradation and destruction is clear. Now, of course, there's even more to WWF than looking after pandas and tigers and protecting the forests in East Africa, because our ultimate goal has always been humans living in harmony with nature. And so that means that we're about respecting and valuing the natural world and finding ways to share the Earth's natural resources fairly, or at least more fairly, to ensure that everybody can flourish. So that means we have to put communities at the heart of our on-the-ground work. And of course, we all know that we all depend on the goods and services that nature, ecosystems in the jargon like forests, provide for us. But poor people, people living in poverty, typically depend on them more and are more directly dependent on them. And I have, well, as you alluded to, a range of slightly unusual mix of experience. I've been at WWF 7 years, and as well as leading the UK operation, I also chair the global board we have internally for our climate and energy work. But my original background professionally, well, after a couple of theology degrees, was in accountancy with Price Waterhouse and then venture capital, and I ended up as finance director of a European packaging group. And then I worked for Oxfam for about 5 years. As finance director and a deputy chief executive, and I was seconded to India for 6 months to head up Oxfam's operations there. In fact, when I was there, we just got a new BJP PM, and there were problems with floods and droughts and indeed an earthquake. And when I was working for Oxfam, I had the privilege to travel to Kenya to see some of Oxfam's work there. It was north of Wajir. So if you look in the northeast, the town in the furthest northeast, and then you keep going northeast to roughly where the S of Somalia is, I was assured that we were on the Kenyan side of the border. Whether we would have noticed, I don't know, because people traverse that border. So it was quite a long way, quite a remote village, similar to this one. And I always remember that for several hours one evening, I sat in the compound of an elderly woman. I'm afraid I don't know her name. It was probably told to me in translation and I didn't make a note. I was focused on the conversation, not on jotting things down. And we talked for a long time about her experience of this village and living there. And one of the things that came out was her worries about the future of the village, because what were the children going to do? Were they going to stay? Because look at all the problems with the water. Look at the problems with their goats. Look at the problems with getting firewood because the forest has been used. Look at the attraction of the city broadcast into the minds of young teenagers 15 hours away from Nairobi, but broadcast by the village chief using lorry batteries, a satellite dish and a television, so that on the payment of a very small fee they can all watch Dallas in the evening. So there were these environmental changes combined with social development which was threatening. What is the future? What are the livelihoods? What will they depend on? How will they develop? She was very concerned about that. And this picture also illustrates the connection between environmental degradation and international development, people development. I don't know what that fish thought as he was finally, or she was finally caught as the mud dried. We work quite a lot on protecting, restoring, sustainably managing oceans and freshwater ecosystems. This is a reservoir in China, completely dried up. As a local villager said, over the past 40 years, this lake has never dried up. Well, we've been working in the Yangtze Basin, particularly in a partnership with HSBC for 12 years now, and grappling with the issues of the impact of climate change, the demands of development, and the integrity of environmental ecosystems. So we don't only want to try and restore the natural balance, we want to think about that in the context of the well-being of communities as well, and find integrated approaches. So, for example, where should I point this? There we are. Mzee Kionga was a village elder from Samanga in Tanzania, the same region that picture's taken, which is off the island of Mafia. We're not in Italy, we're off the coast of Tanzania. And their livelihoods are threatened by environmental degradation and climate change. There's a reef there, fantastic. You can just, if you go out there on a boat, you can see all these wonderful fish and so on. But overfishing has caused problems. Dynamite fishing, for those of you who are not familiar with this, you throw dynamite, it explodes on the surface of the water, it kills all the fish, and pretty much anything else that happens to be around, which all then come up to the surface and float for a bit so you can pick them up. Obviously some concerns by governments about potential links to terrorism. But the local people also attribute the issues with fish not only to overfishing, not only to environmental degradation of the oceans, with pollution and waste and so on, but also to changes in the weather affecting the incoming water from the rivers, higher temperatures, shorter rainfalls, reduced river flow, and so on. So we set up a project with local women and men to look at how to manage the beach area. where they have the power to make decisions about the things that matter to them. How do they preserve nutritious food, preserve their livelihoods, setting up community-based conservation associations, sometimes community-based banks, to manage local resources. And what drives WWF on this is that for the past 40 years, there's been an unprecedented and largely irreversible loss of forests, wetlands, coral reefs, etc., etc. And at the end of this month, our biannual Living Planet report will come out, which will update us all on that. And overall, we're taking 50% more than the Earth can replenish in the course of a year. So we're sort of eating into the capital rather than living off the interest and income. And the bad news is this: the drive to increase living standards, which of course is essential for development, at least living standards for poorer people, could potentially cause even more problems, because it will require more natural resources to be consumed. But if everybody lives the way we do, we'd need 2.5, 3 planets to support humanity. If everybody lived the way the typical North American lived, we'd need maybe 4 or 5 planets. Typical Indian, not such an issue. At least not now, but if we carry on broadcasting images of Dallas lifestyles into the minds of people on television, cinema, phone, tablet screens all around the world, they're all like one of what we've got. So that's going to be a problem. So what we need is a just distribution of the natural resources which is sustainable. Or, to put it as one might, we here in our societies, in the richer societies, will have to live within our means so that others can have the means to live. So there's this fundamental link between poverty, climate change, ecosystem degradation. And by the way, of course, the UN sort of reflects that in one way at least, because we have development goals, we have UNFCCC, climate change, and we have the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. But if we're going to be successful in meeting this challenge of sustainable development, we've got to tackle poverty, climate change, and the destruction of ecosystems in an integrated way. But what does that mean? What does an integrated way mean, particularly when we think about the SDGs? Environmental and development NGOs and academics and others have often come together on climate change because that plays out through natural resources and it undermines the local environment which so many people living in poverty depend on. So we've been thinking about the interconnections between these different elements based on our experience in countries around the world, and how do we bring them together? And we had some hints of that in the presentations from the 3 continents just earlier. And as you see from the slide here, the connections go in both directions. So, for example, if we're going to have, if we can achieve inclusive and low carbon development that will allow us to keep global warming below the critical thresholds of 1.5 degrees, then that's going to help with sustainable development and tackling poverty particularly. And all people, but particularly poor and vulnerable communities, will benefit from that. Now, there's going to be more on that in the session after the break this afternoon, but I want to move on to look further at what integration means in this context, and also to flag up to you that there's this little brochure which has inside it the diagram that you're seeing on the screen and a little bit more detail, so you can read up more about that. And I think we've got copies. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's not smudging. It must have dried out. So we need to integrate this thinking this integrated thinking into all those UN multilateral processes, but I want to show particularly how that applies in the case of the SDGs. How an effective SDG suite can tackle the three dimensions of sustainable development: social, economic and environmental concerns. And at the moment we have a set of proposals. Obviously this doesn't have 17 segments, but just for illustration, on this each wedge is a goal, and it's coloured with the appropriate targets for the goal, covering one of the three dimensions. Orange represents social targets, green of course represents the environmental targets, and purple represents the economic targets. Now you might think that this is a bit like going out for pizza, to one of those places where you can mix and match the pizza depending on who wants what. So as you're looking at this, imagine that this is a pizza. You know, looking maybe something like that. Now, it might be quite tempting, mightn't it? But the problem with this pizza is that it represents precisely a siloed approach. Each slice only has one topping on it. Just like we've tended to go down the route, or predominantly one topping on it, we've tended to go down the route of each goal has targets that only relate to that kind of area. So stay with me. We want to look at how could we change that, because the danger is that we go down this siloed approach, that each person knows which goal they're working on, and they know their kind of target, so that's what they'll deal with. So what we really need is something that looks a bit more like this. Each of the SDG targets, each slice of that pizza, would have toppings from all the different elements. Now, of course, some of you are looking at this and thinking, look, he's supposed to be an environmentalist. This looks a bit excessive on the meat consumption. So I thought of that. Yeah, okay, so we could have this vegetarian version, which actually shows it integrated even better. So now the toppings are integrated, and as you divide that into the goals, the 17 goals, each goal will have targets, toppings, that are from a mix of the three categories of social, economic and environmental. And the point is that doesn't that reflect the reality of how life is, how the world operates, what people's daily experience is? So what that means is, going back to the picture we looked at before, that each of those segments is a goal, but now the targets, the different colours, are integrated. There's a mix of targets from social, environmental and economic in each of the goals. Now, you could look at that and think, well, it looks a bit more messy. But you could remember the pizza analogy and think, but it looks a bit more tasty, a bit more interesting, rather than a very bland single taste. But above all, it reflects the reality of how things work. So just to give a couple of examples, the goal on health has no environmental targets. Now hang on, isn't there sort of a connection between environment and health? I mean, air, water, I think there's a pretty big connection. If you deal with wood-burning stoves in rural parts of the world, you're dealing with health and you're dealing with environment. But there are two other elements we have to consider as well in order to achieve great progress on the Sustainable Development Agenda, and particularly one that is more than the sum of its parts. So have I got... Sorry. Yeah, just before we go to that. So this is an analysis we've done of each of the 17 goals. Don't worry, there won't be a test on this in a minute. Each of the 17 goals, looking at the kind of targets they've got And are those targets environmental, economic or social? And as you can see, there are some where there does look quite a good mix of goals, of targets. But many of the goals are very bland. And we think this needs quite a bit more work. So, back to this picture of the kind of pizza we want. Not that pizza where each wedge, each goal is a single colour. It might have a colour underneath. Maybe the base is made. The pizza base has got different components in different bits. But the toppings, the targets, have got to be properly integrated, so that we don't have people who think, well, I just do this. No, we all have to work together, of course in a structured and focused way, but taking account of other concerns and other kinds of target. Look, for example, at the targets on economics, economic development. They're almost entirely economic. There's nothing about environmental constraints and social implications there, or very little. But I said there are two other things, finally, that we have to consider. And if you look at the diagram, you'll see that there are two things going round the edge. One is good governance, and the other is means of implementation, which was referred to earlier. Well, I just want to say a word about those two. You may have heard already in my background. I also have connections with Transparency International. I'm currently the chair of TI UK. So it won't surprise you that I want to highlight the importance of good governance in all aspects of this, so that infuses the implementation of the SDGs. And talking of implementation, if we're going to make a reality of our aspirations, then we have to have adequate resources to deliver these goals, to transform the life experience of billions of people. In the technical vocabulary the UN use, we need to have the means of implementation. Now, I'm worried that some of you are thinking, yeah, but the edge of the pizza, you know, those nasty crusty bits that you usually leave on the side of the plate. We don't really want to bother too much about those. So I want to be very clear. I'm talking about, and get it up there.
How'd you get the crust in the middle?
Oops, wrong one I'm pushing. There we are. What we need is a stuffed crust pizza, where we've got good governance and the means of implementation all the way around the edge. We've got nice mixed toppings, targets, on all parts of the structure, and then we can slice it into the limited number, 17 currently, goals. That's what we want, and you will, I hope, sympathise with my slight obsession with food, having had nothing but airport snacks and airline food for the last 24 hours. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed.